Greetings, my name is Tony Silva, and I recently answered a lot of questions on macaws, how to care for them, their diet, and also some interesting aspects such as mutations and hybrids. There's something I want to reiterate, and that is a proper diet. They need fat in their diet. They also need beta-carotene rich vegetables like carrots and pumpkin and American sweet potato. If they don't get enough vitamin A, they will easily come down with fungus. And the other point is hygiene. If you are not prepared to sleep on the floor of that cage, then your hygiene is not good enough. Every day I get messages from there asking me, how do I treat this sick bird? How do I resolve this problem with infertility? Invariably, when I ask for a video or a photo of the cage, it's very dirty. You need to understand that hygiene impacts fertility because the birds can have subclinical signs that are bacterial in origin and that affect fertility and also overall health. Once a macaw starts to get sick, it's very difficult to turn it around and save it. I stress that because it is the key to success in macaw keeping. Thank you. The ideal temperature for macaws is around 28 degrees, but that does not mean that they don't have a higher and lower tolerance. So the lowest tolerance level would be 0. Obviously, toes can freeze at 0 and they can suffer from frostbite. So if they get that cold, you need to provide both shelter from the wind and a heated perch so that the toes can stay warm. The perch should also be of a sufficient size so that a resting bird can cover the toes with its breast feathers. The high end is 40 degrees. Above 40, it becomes critical and you can lose them. So clearly, if it gets above 40, you need to have the proper parameters to allow the bird to cool off. That may mean micro misters, it will mean shade, it will mean improving airflow. One of the biggest problems that I see when I travel, particularly in Asia, is that you have inherited from the British these very enclosed aviaries. Everything's very enclosed, there's very poor airflow. That's not good for heat. It's perfect for a cold climate. It's not good when the temperature gets very high. It prevents airflow and it doesn't allow the birds to cool themselves with that airflow. Macaws, the large macaws especially, have a very strong beak that evolved to eat palm seeds particularly and other fatty foods. This means that the bigger the beak, the higher the fat requirement. The smaller the beak, the lesser the fat requirement. So a scarlet macaw would have the lower end of the fat requirement. A hyacinth and a greenwing would have the higher end of the fat requirement. So fat should represent no less than 10% of the diet and as high as 40% in hyacinth macaws. And the type of fat is important. Peanuts are the worst. Peanuts are a high risk of aflatoxins. They're not good. Ideal nuts are almonds, walnuts, macadamia. For some of the macaws with a smaller beak, macadamias would be too hard to break. So you would have to either offer them cracked or offer all their nuts. Peanuts are absolutely not a go. They're not recommended. They run the risk of infecting the birds with aflatoxins. The smaller macaws, you can supplement the fat requirements with some sunflower seeds. I like to give about 40 to 60% pellets, 10 to 40% fats, and obviously that varies depending on species, and vegetables. I don't believe that macaws have evolved to process a lot of sugars, so therefore fruits should not be fed. Peanut butter can certainly be made at home, but you have to be assured that the peanuts are not contaminated with aflatoxins, and you can't see or smell aflatoxins with the naked eye. You can't smell it with your nose, so you have to be very careful. The best oils to supplement would be a mixture of macadamia, walnut, coconut, all of the nut oils would be perfect. You can add a little bit of extra virgin olive oil. Red palm oil is definitely not good for macaws. They don't do well with it. It's the wrong fatty chain. And in chicks, you can even lose them. You've got to be very careful in selecting the type of fats that you use in the diet. If you were going to use palm oil, I would say skip it and use sunflower seeds. They're certainly a far better source of fat than red palm oil. If you could get some of the palm oils that they would normally eat in the wild, that's a different story. But to my knowledge, none of those oils are commercially available. Macaws will breed in any cage size. Parrot Jungle used to breed them in cages that were very small. Busch Gardens used to breed them in cages that were 3 feet square, 90 centimeters square, and about 2.4 meters high. But that's not optimum. You have to look at one factor. Do you want to breed from a pair of birds during 10 years, or do you want them to have a productive life of 25 to 30 years? The smaller the cage, the shorter that lifespan will be. Ideally, you would want at least 2.4 meters in length. The width and the height can vary. I would say as a minimum, the width would be 1.2 meters. We keep our macaws in cages that are about 4.2 meters long, and that I think is optimum for them. It allows them to fly, it allows them to exercise. So yes, you can keep them in small cages, but it's not healthy long term, and you want to be able to have production from that pair of macaws as long as possible. The nest of the macaws will vary depending on the species. Blue-throated macaws like a vertical nest. So something 45 centimeters by 45 centimeters by about 1 meter 20 deep would be perfect. And the reason they like this vertical nest is because they nest only in palm trees. When you look at hyacinths and greenwings and scarlets and all the other large macaws, they readily accept varying nests because in the wild they're not exclusively a palm tree nester. They nest in tree cavities, they nest in cliff faces. So they nest in a variety of sites. For all the other macaws, other than the blue throats, and I'm referring specifically to the large macaws, a nest about 1.2 meters long by about 45 centimeters high by about 35 centimeters deep would be perfect. And this is a horizontal nest that allows the chicks to spread out. Macaw chicks tend to overheat very easily. For the smaller macaws, you use a depth. So let's say yellow collared or severe, you would use a nest that would be 35 centimeters square by about 90 centimeters deep. Macaws are a typical South American parrot in that two birds will bond even if they're the same gender. In fact, it's quite common for young immature macaws to bond with one another, and when you go ahead and check the gender of those birds, they're invariably of the same gender. So when they are mature, that's when they tend to pick a mate of the opposite sex. What I would always try to do is to raise a group together, to monitor them, to see which two birds hang together, and then have them surgically sexed or genetically sexed. So you can verify that in fact the two birds that have bonded are a pair. Natural bonding is preferred to forced pairing because the two birds are compatible. Scarlet macaws, for example, tend to be very argumentative. And if you let them pair off naturally, they tend to be less quarrelsome. So, whenever possible, allow natural pairing. People often say, oh, the pair has been mating or they feed each other. Why aren't they nesting? My response is always the same. If parrots bred that easily, they would be worth the same thing as chickens. Parrots are not easy to breed. Yes, some species like cockatiels are literally domesticated, but most of the other parrots are not, and macaws certainly aren't. You need to exhibit some patience. That a pair of birds spend time in the nest or that they feed and mate doesn't mean that they're going to be producing eggs, and it doesn't mean they're going to be producing fertile eggs. You need to show patience always and understand that the birds are going through a natural process of bonding. They're understanding each other. They're establishing limits within a pair or within a group. And courtship feeding is just simply a way of having a friend. We humans tend to eat with our friends. It doesn't mean that we're going to take them as a partner. So you need to understand that feeding and preening and even mating doesn't mean that they're going to breed. Macaws reach sexual maturity on average of between 3 and 5 years. Blue and golds and scarlets will breed at 3 years. Usually males require an additional year to be fertile. But the onset of sexual maturity has a lot of factors that come into play. Diet, hygiene. If the birds are kept dirty, they may have subclinical signs of the disease. So the birds look healthy, but they may have some internal factors going on that will prevent them from breeding. Climate, nest box, bonding, many factors come into play. And again, I reiterate, it's not as simple as putting two birds together, giving them a nest, feeding them a diet, and expecting babies. If it would be that easy, macaws would be worth $100. They're not, and they're worth a lot more than that because they are complex creatures. They require a good diet, proper hygiene, the proper nest, patience. The greatest virtue that an aviculturist can have is simply patience. And understanding that those birds will take time to go through maturity, to go through, to figure out their limits within a pair, and to become reproductively active. The general rule in aviculture is that males take longer to mature. If you have a pair, an older male is always much more helpful because he will tend to drive the female and stimulate her. He'll attract her inside the nest. And I always recommend filling a nest up with wood because it brings the pair inside the nest, and that darkness induces the sexual organs to swell up with blood and for the birds to become reproductively active. If you lose a bird from a pair, it's always better to lose the hen, because if a male is proven, he will entice any other female into nesting. So that's very important to understand, that having a healthy, active, sexually stimulated male is far better than having a sexually stimulated female. He will entice her into nesting. As to what you can do, simply giving them the right conditions, giving them enrichment. Keeping that pair of birds mentally challenged is very important, because if they feel real comfortable, they will proceed to do what nature intended them to do, which is to reproduce. Macaws should always be genetically sexed as a minimum. Two birds mating, feeding, and going through all of the rituals of nesting does not mean they are a pair. I had a friend that kept a pair of military macaws for 30 years. They were both males. They would spend time in the nest. They would mate. They would do everything indicative of a pair, except obviously they couldn't produce eggs. Interestingly enough, that particular pair of birds, if given eggs, would incubate them and would rear the chicks. So behavior cannot be used as a guide to gender. It's always better to genetically sex, and if you can, to surgically sex, because then you can look inside and see how healthy the birds are. If they have aspergillosis, which is very common, a real common problem in Asia. The birds are kept in cramped conditions when the monsoon comes or when the dusty season comes. They get a lot of these spores and they develop aspergillosis. Obviously, a bird with asper is not going to be reproductively very good. So you want to not only genetically sex, but also surgically sex to gauge the quality of the bird internally. And that will dictate a lot of times how quickly or how slow that bird is to breed. A bird that looks good, but is subclinically ill, meaning that it's got some health issues that you can detect, it's not going to be very successful as a breeder. The easiest species to breed are the blue and golds. The hardest is the green wing. The hyacinth falls someplace in between. I don't find hyacinths to be very particularly difficult to breed if you provide them with a proper diet. And the proper diet means a high fat element in the diet. Lots of nuts, walnuts and macadamia nuts, etc. Blue and golds will breed on just about anything. You could feed them a parrot mix with a good source of mineral and calcium, and they will reproduce. Nothing induces a pair of macaws quicker to nest than having a pair of healthy birds that are receiving the proper diet and that have a proper nest. And sometimes macaws are very peculiar about their nesting sites. They may want to nest on the ground. They may want to nest at mid-level. They may want to nest very high in an exposed area. It's always good to offer several nests and then to remove the ones that the birds do not like. I have a pair of scarlets, for example, that will nest in the front part of their cage, in a nest that sits on the bottom of the cage, and that is open. They like that type of nest. And they showed me that by sitting in that area and by the hen laying eggs in that spot. She didn't like the high nest that I offered her. So if you give them several nests, that's often a key to stimulating them, the proper diet, having the sufficient level of fat. And then adding wood to the nest to stimulate them to come inside, to prepare the nest, to work together, to focus the male's attention to nest preparation. Because this darkness and this nest preparation induces the gonads, the sexual organs, to swell and for the birds to become reproductively active.